All right. Thanks for hanging in with us. I know things are running a little late and you're waiting for lunch, but this is the local to national panel, how to make stories that are happening wherever you live work at a national level. I'm Tracy Mumford from American Public Media, and I'm here to talk about some of the work I did on a podcast called 74 Seconds.
And I'm Adizah Eghan. I'm a producer at Snap Judgment, and I'm here to talk about a story that we produce at Snap called Counted, an Oakland Story. Yeah. So let's get to it. Like I said, I produce for a national show called Snap Judgment, and when we decided to do Counted, we were aware that we were doing a very local story, right? It's a story about Oakland. And it's also a documentary about homicide in Oakland. And so I'm going to play a little bit of the beginning so that you can get an idea of what it sounds like, what we were doing, kind of like get a feel for the story.
Yeah, so can you play clip one?
Clip one, Counted. There's a long fade in. It's New Year's Eve 2016. I'm at St. Columba Church in Oakland. Outside, a group of people circle around the lawn. In the garden, there's over 80 slim white wooden crosses. And on each cross, written in marker, is a name, an age, and a date of death. They stand for Oakland's homicide victims this year. Today, each name will be read and each cross pulled up from the ground.
First is Carlos. His date of death, January 9th. Demetrius.
Every year, there are mothers, fathers, children walking around Oakland with no idea that they'll be a statistic by the end of the year. We wanted to know who these people were and who they left behind. So beginning January 1st, 2017, we decided to reach out to the families and friends of each homicide victim. So that's like the very beginning of the story, and then we kind of go in to the victims and some of the names that are read on the crosses and talk about their lives, the people who they left behind in Oakland and what those people are dealing with after their death. And so I think, one of the things you can ask about the story is like, what makes this a story? I think in a lot of newsrooms, or even for us at Snap Judgment, like this would not be a story, right? It was just in the beginning, in the early phases, it was just a story about homicide. And it was like, what are we doing that's new? What are we doing that's different? So when you're doing these stories that, like something that's so macro, like homicide, this big issue, right? It might look the same in a lot of cities, but your job is to zero in on really specific stories, things that can only be told from the vantage point of your city. So, for example, like we have a really big issue with migration in Oakland, a lot of people moving out to the outer suburbs. And so there was a mom who, after her son had died, she didn't feel safe in her neighborhood. She didn't feel safe where she was. And so she was thinking about moving to Antioch, to some of these outer suburbs. So we were telling this really local story, and then there were other issues that went along with that, and she couldn't actually move, and she had to stay where she was. But I felt like that, in telling that story, it kept it an Oakland story for us, a story that was very, very local and that people were talking about out in East Oakland. And then another one of your jobs too is you can also tell your listener why you think this is important. So I think for us at Snap, we were like, here's why we care, right? Like this is what's happening in our backyard. And even though we're a national show, every once in a while we like to do stuff that's in our backyard and tell stories about our neighbors. And so we set that scene, we set that tone in the beginning, so our listeners could come along with us.
Yeah, so when I made 74 Seconds, I was working in the Minnesota Public Radio newsroom. I technically have the power to control the slides, but maybe not. And In the summer of 2016, a man named Philando Castile was pulled over by a police officer for a broken taillight, and he was killed. And we were approaching this story as a local newsroom, but obviously this is a story that has repercussions and ramifications all over the country. So if you're thinking about a story that you'd like to cover that takes place where you live or outside, New York or LA or something like that, something to think about is how does this relate to a bigger national conversation? And I was one of the producers on a team of 5 people working on this podcast, and we can just play a short little clip. Clip 2, please.
At 9:02 p.m., a police officer runs the plates on that white Oldsmobile.
21 to 20. What's your location?
He radios his partner, who's just down the road in another car.
Fire. Copy. I'm going to stop a car. 203 Tom Mary.
And then, at 9:04, he turns on his lights.
I'm Rehan Fashir.
I'm John Collins.
And this is 74 Seconds.
What happens in 74 seconds? You take about 20 breaths in 74 seconds. Your heart beats fewer than 100 times in 74 seconds. And 74 seconds after flashing his lights at that white Oldsmobile, Officer Geronimo Yanez fired 7 shots into the driver.
How does that happen? And what happens next? That's what we're trying to find out.
So we made this podcast because we knew it was a conversation that stretched far beyond our newsroom, far beyond Minnesota. This is a conversation that was happening all over the country. And then the story escalated because something happened in Minnesota that had never happened before and has happened in relatively few states around the country. The officer was actually charged in the killing of Philando Castile. Trials of police officers are extremely, extremely rare. So we knew in handling this story, not only did it contribute to a national conversation, but we had the chance to walk people day by day through a trial that very few of these trials happen, and a lot of people have questions about when they happen, how do they work? Do they work? And these were just some of the questions that our reporters were out in the newsroom shaping. So I think when you're thinking about a story that you want to tell at a national level, is it a thing that happens a lot of places and you want to widen that conversation with your own experience in your backyard? Is it a thing that's not happening anywhere that you can let people in on the details of what's happening that's specific to where you are? In this case, 74 Seconds had a little bit of both. And we ended up having almost as many listeners in California as we did in Minnesota with a podcast that we just started making in St. Paul, Minnesota. So you can take the opportunity to widen the audience for the stories that you're telling from wherever you are, because it taps into things that are happening everywhere. So that's something to think about when you're shaping your project, is who do I want to speak to? How do I do that? What conversation am I contributing to with this? So once you've decided, like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to make this story, I'm going to put it in front of a national audience, the only way you're going to know that it's going to work when it's still just an idea in your head is if you start calling people, if you start gaining sources, if you start trying to build the story, because then anyone who tries to shut you down, to say, maybe we don't need to do as many episodes, maybe we don't need to do this as a podcast. If you have interesting tape, if you have good people who are already talking to you, that is your proof that you can keep going and keep pushing this story. If you just bring an outline and people seem unsure, you can back it up with the research that you've already done. So start putting in those document requests like Madeline Barron was discussing earlier this morning. Even though they can take forever, start now. Start building your lists, start talking to people. You're gonna get way, way more tape than you ever think you're going to use. And you're right, you're gonna use like 5% of it, but you need all of it in order to cut it down to the pieces that you really need.
Yeah. How many people have ever started a project and been like, oh, fuck, I don't know where to begin? Yeah, me too. So I think that a lot of the times, we're talking about local to national reporting. We're also talking about like reporting and telling stories that end up taking a long time to report. So I think it's totally fine to start big. Everything informs the process, everything informs your story. But while you're starting big and while you're going big, I think it's important to keep in mind who you want to be your interviewees and focus on that, narrow your sight on getting those people. So you're working on, as you're kind of talking to general people, folks who are available, you're also trying to find the people who you can get with more access over time, who you can kind of build relationships with. And yeah, be patient, because you're probably going to be working on this story for some time. So a lot of the information that you can get in the beginning when you're doing the high-level search for documents and everything can help you out when you're actually getting that really intimate interview towards the end of the process, and you can kind of pair those things together to make a stronger story. And also, part of talking to people, part of approaching people, is having a pitch that you bring with you in the field. I think as a reporter, I talk to a lot of people who are kind of starting, who are more producers, right? They sit in their desks and they call people on the phone, and they're not really used to going out and talking to people face to face. And I think something that's really helped me in talking to people face to face is having a pitch. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It's just a couple of lines that are just like, hey, here's my name, here's where I work, and I'm doing a story on X. So I'm going to play a clip from Finding Cleo. This is a podcast that I really like. It's a reporter, Connie Walker, who specializes on telling the stories of Indigenous women who are missing and murdered. And it's more than just true crime. It's really, I found it very educational. She's really informing you on the history of kind of Indigenous women and the relationship to the state, Canada. So in this clip, you hear Connie walking up to a house in kind of this awkward moment. I faded it under so that there wouldn't be any spoilers. So this is clip 3.
Hi, I'm looking for Lee Madonia. Hi Lee, my name is Connie Walker. I'm a reporter with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I'm here because I'm working with a family in Canada, and they've been looking for their sibling, a young girl named Cleo. Right. And we think that it might be...
I fade under. But basically, you can imagine that this moment is pretty awkward. And what I like about it is the transparency. I like that I'm getting to hear how she is giving her pitch, right? This is a very simple pitch. She's giving her name. She says where she works. And then she kind of adds a little bit more, and she asks a question. And that's all you really need. I personally like to have a couple more lines ready, because there are some people who they want to help you, and they'll be, as soon as you kind of mention what you're doing and you have this project, they'll want to help you and they'll want to be on board. And there's some people who also, they might not quite understand what you're doing, so you want to have another line just to be like, actually, this is what I'm doing. It's really a story, for example, with our story, this is a story on homicide, and I was like, I want to do something that goes beyond the news, that goes beyond the headlines, that goes beyond just saying someone's name really quickly. I want to capture the ripple effect of homicide, and kind of in sharing that with people, there was more interest in talking to me.
Yeah, and one thing as you're talking to people, especially if you're chasing stories in smaller areas or you're doing something in your own backyard, all the people that you talk to after you've given them your pitch, there's a good chance they might not understand what a podcast is, right? Something easy to forget when we're at a conference like this and everyone eats, sleeps, breathes podcasts. But I feel like we really have the responsibility when we are putting a microphone in front of people and collecting tape that they understand where that tape could go. This made a lot of sense coming from a local newsroom. Some people think oh, maybe this will end up in a 15-second cut on the morning news and then it'll be gone. That's different than living in a podcast that is online until who knows when, and being promoted and put in front of a national audience helping people understand where that tape could go is important, and it's worth taking the time for people to understand what your project is going to be. Sometimes that could be slightly nerve-wracking for people, understanding that it's not just a local news piece that'll disappear. Sometimes that can actually help people open up, people who think like, oh, this is going to be at a national scale, like I can make time, I can do this. We actually, we were trying again and again and again to get any representative of any police department to talk to us as we were covering this story. And the one department that talked to us, when they finally agreed, said, oh yeah, we've been listening to your podcast. And I was like, oh, okay, that's what it took for you to call us back. That's fine. But helping people understand the project can get people on board where they might not have understood before. So just take the extra minutes and explain it.
Yeah. So this is the fun part, rules that we broke that made our stories better. So basically, like, you got to break the rules. The rules were made to be broken. And I think, there are some things that we did at SNAP that we tried that definitely go against the convention. So like the first one, which I also feel like can be a barrier too, is just the organizational aspect of it. Sometimes you don't know what you're doing, and that's okay. So like we mentioned before, like just talking to people and letting the tape guide you, letting the moments that are surprising to you in your interviews be the moments that are surprising to your listeners in the story. And then also narrate less and trust your tape. So I think often when people are doing these reported stories, these kind of like in-depth stories, they narrate a lot. And I understand, like, you have to give a lot of context. And sometimes what I find is easier to do is to over-narrate and then pull back a little bit. Like, you are going to have a lot of tape, and you want to let your tape breathe for itself and kind of, let the story unfold with the sound. And so narrating less is really key for that. And then kind of going along those lines, try using a non-producer narrator who's connected to the story. So in Counted, we met Daryl Allums kind of along the way. He was someone who's from Deep East Oakland who had lost a lot of family members, and he was just tired of it, so he started carrying a poster board on the street, and he was out there, and he would stand out there at the intersection and be like, stop killing our kids. And he was at all the events. He was at barbecues, he was at meeting groups, he was everywhere, and he had similar goals to us. He was also tracking the murders and tracking violence in Oakland in his own way. And so probably like halfway through reporting this process, we brought him in as a co-host. And so we would talk to him and kind of like have him in on the meetings, and we would just all kind of share ideas together. And also, what that looks like for working with someone who isn't necessarily a producer is we would have scripted lines. So like in the script, we had everything written out just so we knew where we were going. But then I would have him do kind of like one read with that, and then we would step away and I'd be like, okay, but like what really happened? Or he would say something and I would ask him some questions about it. So that's why when you listen to the story, you can hear there's kind of like a two-way Q&A moment, and then there's also moments where we have him on the street, and I'm there with the microphone next to him, and then you also have moments that are more like scripted lines, like traditional tracking, and it kind of made for a really interesting format for the story, something that people continue to kind of like come up to me to this day and are like, oh, that was really interesting how you did that. How did you do that?
Yeah, if you have not listened to Counted yet, you should go and you should listen to it twice. Once, because you should just appreciate the whole thing, and second, you should listen to how they are using a non-producer narrator. They're telling this hyper-local story, and they brought in essentially the equivalent of like the man on the street to help tell that story in the position as co-narrator. It's really fascinating, and I hope more people try things like what's happening in Counted. Some other rules that you could break, they might be rules that just you listen to a lot of podcasts and you've never heard anyone try that before. They could be rules at your workplace. When we're making this breaking news podcast, our newsroom never uses music on anything ever. Absolutely not. It's never going to happen. And we used music in our podcast, and that ruffled some feathers, but it connected with the audience. We got a higher listenership. It sounded different than what people heard, and sometimes that's okay, and sometimes that's good. Don't be afraid. I would say one thing, if you're covering a story and you're tracking it, don't be afraid to cover it in real time. So when we made 74 Seconds, it was back in 2016. The Daily had only been going for a couple months, long time ago. And there had been an idea before that podcasts had to be evergreen in a way. They had to be fresh. You had to wait till something had happened so you could look back and tell that story. They couldn't cover things as they were happening. Obviously, we have a whole fleet of daily podcasts now. We have people doing daily updates on things as they break, and I think we should just keep pushing all of those rules. We ended up covering this trial of a police officer day by day by day to keep people in the loop. And at first, we thought we would go back and condense all those episodes or delete them. We thought no one will ever want to listen to those after the fact because they'll already know what happens and they won't be useful. People still listen to them. People write in and say, I binged on the whole thing, including all the trial updates, even though I knew the verdict. So people find value in being walked through something step by step. So just attack it however you think is going to work. And also, you can switch up formats. Not all of your episodes have to sound the same. You can go out into the field, or if you're always in the field, come into a studio and do a Q&A. You can do a short episode. You can do a long episode. Depending on if you have underwriting, that could affect things. We did not have underwriting. But when you mix things up, you give yourself some opportunities for creativity. You can give your audience a break. You can give them something they might never have heard before. We really struggled with this idea as we were trying to tell the story of a police shooting and of the man, Philando Castile, who was killed. Obviously, we can't have his voice in the episode, and there's this gap as we're trying to explain people's loss and what we're talking about. And so we did an episode where when they released all of the files after the trial, it included an inventory of all the things that had been in his car the night that he was killed. And we did an episode where we listed everything that was in his car, and it's reading items for 6 to 8 minutes, and that was the episode. And that's the episode that I hear people have the most questions about or people wonder about, and it was just us late in a studio taking a risk on something. We can play a short clip of it.
A pair of crisp white sneakers, still in the box, surrounded by crumpled up paper. 2 bags of Hall's cough drops, cherry and honey lemon, an inhaler, a spare tire, a jack, a sauce packet of honey mustard from McDonald's, a pair of black work shoes, an invitation to a preschool graduation on July 8th, 2016, 2 days after the shooting.
So that didn't sound like anything else we did. It didn't sound like anything else we did after, but we got a lot of response on that episode because we tried something else. So whatever that looks like for your show, for your story, try something.
Mm-hmm. And so we're coming to the end. We're just going to make a couple more points, and then we're going to take questions. But one thing I think about a lot, and to me feels like the lasting effect of this story, is just the role of race and representation in storytelling. And so I think that a story, like Counted, like 74 Seconds, these stories need to be told and are very important. But also, one of the things I think about, when I'm interviewing people, is am I re-traumatizing people? And even after I've interviewed people, in going through these moments, what is the impact of this, and is it worth it? And so, as we're talking about reporting these more in-depth stories, these local stories, I challenge people to think about their responsibility as a reporter and a producer, because a lot of these are news stories, and news stories tend to go for the drama and, and the big surprise, the big, something that will really get people to pay attention. But is that serving us?
Yeah, and I think not only which stories you're choosing to tell, but how you're choosing to tell them is really critical. And you're going to make all of the choices. Everything that someone listening to your story hears, you made that choice to play it, to cut it that way, to put two pieces back to back. And 74 Seconds is a story that has a lot of really difficult, awful tape associated with it. There is tape of Philando Castile's last moments that his girlfriend Damon Reynolds broadcast on Facebook Live. There's tape from the police car that evening. And some news outlets will play that tape whole in its entirety without warning, just splash it up while anchors talk over it. We made very deliberate choices about when to play tape, when not to play tape, how much of that tape to play. And they're choices that you have to think about, and choices that I think I'm still thinking about even after the show. So not just what kinds of stories you're telling, but how you're choosing to tell them, especially when we live in this age of a lot of true crime or high drama things. Think about, what tape you're using and why, and can you explain if someone asked exactly how much you played of it or why you played it or when you played it. And with that, I think we have 3 minutes if people have questions.
Mm-hmm. I think you were first.
Oh,
yeah.
Great. I recently listened to Counted last week. I thought it was absolutely phenomenal, amazing.
Thank you.
My question is about, how do you decide, because it was a year long of reporting, I'm assuming that was done for the piece.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really interesting to me because everything else that I had listened to before along the same veins was, serial, weekly. And so did you decide beforehand that you were going to take the entire year and then decide to just do that as a 1 hour special? Or how did you decide beforehand or afterhand if you were going to do it as a special, like an hour long, or chronologizing, taking documentation of the homicides as they were happening every single week, every single month? How did you decide if you're going to do it weekly, monthly, or just all in a year in one special?
Mm-hmm. So we knew that this was going to be like a long form project. And we had the opening scene of Counted is at the church, and then at the closing scene, we go back to the church a year later. And so all the names that the priest is reading are names that you are familiar with because you heard their little obit in the story. And so we kind of knew we had the year-to-year frame. It actually took us 15 months to put the whole thing together. But from December 31st, 2016 to December 31st, 2017. We knew that was the time frame of the story. But in terms of was it going to be a podcast? Was it going to be an episode? We were thinking about podcasts, but I think we weren't inclined to want to make it a podcast. We knew it kind of had to stand together, but we were going back and forth between 2 episodes and 1. And so actually when we brought it to the group edit process, something we do at Snap Judgment is when a story is kind of towards the end, we've done a lot of passes on it. You bring it to the group, everybody listens. It's kind of like a gut check. And the feedback from Glenn was that it should be an hour long. It would be tighter if it was an hour. So then we went back and we made it an hour. And we still were kind of like, oh, should we have made it 2 hours? But yeah, it was really just like a back and forth thing.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. And there's no pros or cons or doing it in long form versus short form? There was just a matter of taste and personalities of what you wanted to do?
Yeah, I think our concern was that it would be too much and too long if it was 2 episodes, and we could keep people if we had it really tight as 1 episode, which was tough because we had certain stories that were longer than others, and certain stories they were stories within themselves, so you wanted I felt like I had 30 to 50 minutes to tell about one family, and that ultimately ended up being a 20-minute long story, which is one of the longer stories that plays in the beginning. But we felt like they say with editing, sometimes it's just if you can make it tighter, and the more kind of the tighter your editing is, then the better the story kind of plays out, because there aren't the moments for it to lag.